You ever wonder how we got from, I don't know, chewing on willow bark to robotic surgery? Well, the history of medicine, it's not this nice, neat, straight line of progress. No way. It's more like a story full of these huge leaps, these aha moments, and even some pretty intense rivalries that totally flipped our understanding of the human body on its head. So let's dive into four of these turning points, moments that didn't just push medicine forward, they completely rewrote the rules. Okay, so our story kicks off with what has to be one of the biggest misconceptions in all of history. You see, the famous Greek historian Herodotus, he goes to ancient Babylon, and this is what he writes. And I mean, it paints this picture of a super primitive place, right? No real doctors, sick people are just kind of left on the street, hoping some random passerby has a good idea. And for a long, long time, people just believed him. That was the story. Yeah, about that. He was wrong, like completely 100% wrong. The Babylonians didn't just have doctors. They had this incredibly sophisticated, regulated, and specialized medical system that was already ancient by the time Herodotus even showed up. And that right there, that's our first big turning point, the very birth of the medical profession. We're talking long before the Greeks. In Mesopotamia, they had this whole complex system for taking care of the sick, and it was this fascinating mix of the spiritual and the physical. And get this, it wasn't a one-size-fits-all kind of deal. Nope, their medical world was actually split between two totally different but, equally important types of healers. Let's dig into who these people were. So check this out. They had this amazing division of labor. On one hand, you had the Azu. Think of them as the practitioner, the physician. They were all about the physical stuff, setting bones, doing surgeries, mixing up herbal remedies. They'd actually listen to what you had to say and look at the evidence. But then, on the other hand, you had the Ashipu. This was more like your spiritual healer or even an exorcist. They were looking for supernatural causes, like, did a sin cause this illness, or is a demon involved? And what's really cool is these two weren't rivals. People, even the king, would go see both of them. And don't think this was some informal backyard operation. Oh no, this was a highly regulated profession, laid out in one of the most famous legal codes ever, the Code of Hammurabi. We're talking fees set by law. There was even a sliding scale depending on if you were rich, a regular person, or a slave. The government could actually come in and inspect a doctor's work. And if a surgeon botched a job, the punishments were, well, let's just say they were severe. We're talking about potentially having your hands cut off. This was absolutely serious business. All right, let's jump way forward in time now to the Islamic Golden Age for our second turning point. This is where we meet a physician who was basically the Sherlock Holmes of his day, a medical detective who used the power of just looking and thinking, pure observation, to crack a really deadly case. His name was Abu Bakr al-Razi. He was a Persian physician back in the 9th and 10th centuries, and wow, this guy was a pioneer. He was doing experimental medicine when that just wasn't a thing. His methods were so far ahead of their time, it's incredible. And there's this one story about him that just perfectly sums up his genius. So the city of Baghdad needs a new hospital, right? And they ask al-Razi to pick the best spot. Now, what does he do? Does he look at the stars, consult some dusty old scroll? Nope. He runs an experiment. He takes fresh cuts of meat and hangs them up in different neighborhoods all across the city. Then he just watches to see which piece of meat rots the slowest. His conclusion? The place where the meat stayed fresh the longest must have the purest, healthiest air. I mean, how brilliant is that? It's a perfect, simple example of the scientific method hundreds of years before it became a big deal in Europe. But honestly, his biggest claim to fame was cracking a medical mystery that had stumped doctors forever. See, before al-Razi, everyone thought smallpox and measles were just the same disease. But he, through just incredibly careful, patient observation, looking at every little symptom, he was the first person to say, wait a minute, these are two different things. And that breakthrough, that simple distinction, undoubtedly saved countless lives. Okay, on to turning point number 3. Let's rocket forward to 19th century Europe. For basically all of history, we'd been looking at the human body as this whole thing. But then powerful microscopes came along, and suddenly we could zoom in. Way in. And what we found was a whole other universe hiding inside us, the world of the cell. And the guy at the absolute center of this revolution was a German physician named Rudolf Virchow. In 1858, he dropped this bombshell of a book, Cellular Pathology.
And his big idea, his core argument was this: all diseases are, at their root, diseases of ourselves. It sounds so simple to us now, right? But back then, wow, that one idea changed everything. It's literally the foundation of modern pathology.
And Virchow didn't stop there. He took his microscope to the brain, and he was the first to really describe and name those other cells in our nervous system, the ones that aren't the famous neurons. He called them glia, which is Greek for glue, because he thought they just held everything together. And for ages, his drawings were considered the very first pictures of these super important cells.
But what if they weren't the first? What if I told you the real story here is a messy tale of politics, a bitter academic rivalry, and a brilliant discovery that just got lost to history thanks to some really bad luck? Okay, so here's what really went down. The story is just a wild mix of politics and bad timing. It all starts in 1848. Virchow, who was a bit of a political revolutionary, gets himself fired from his job in Berlin. Now, at that exact moment, this other pathologist, Heinrich Müller, is the shoo-in for big job, the chair of pathology at Würzburg University. But then, Würzburg gets word that the famous Virchow is on the market. So what do? They give the job to Virchow instead. Müller is just crushed. He ends up in a sanatorium. He's so depressed. He eventually switches his whole field of study, and in 1851, that's a full 7 years before Virchow's famous book comes out, Müller publishes the very first, and honestly probably a better, drawing of a glial cell. We even call it the Müller cell today. It's just an amazing example of how history isn't always fair, It's often written by the winners.
All right, for our last turning point, we're coming right up to the present day, because this one is happening as we speak. It's the story of how these incredibly ancient, holistic medical traditions are dealing with our modern world's demand for cold, hard, scientific proof. So let's look at two of the biggest and oldest systems out there, Ayurveda from India and traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM. Both of these are ancient, incredibly complex systems. At their heart, they're all about balance. In Ayurveda, it's about balancing 3 forces called doshas. In TCM, it's about balancing the 2 opposing forces of yin and yang.
But here's where it gets really interesting. In our modern era, these 2 ancient traditions have gone down completely different roads when it comes to dealing with Western science. One of them has really leaned in hard, actively chasing scientific validation through research papers, studies, and patents.
And honestly, you just have to look at the numbers. The data tells a pretty clear story. If you go to PubMed, a huge scientific database, and search for Chinese medicine, you get more than 10,000 hits. Now, try searching for Ayurvedic medicine. You get just over 1,000. And the patent gap? It's even crazier. We're talking 195 US patents granted for TCM versus only 3 for Ayurveda. So what's the takeaway? Well, it's that TCM, with a huge push from the government, has gone all in on building a modern, scientific evidence base for its practices. And the results of that strategy in dollars and cents, it's just staggering. China's yearly production of herbal drugs is now a $48 billion industry. That's billion with a B. It's just a massive example of what can happen when you successfully bridge that gap between ancient wisdom and modern science.
So when you step back and look at the whole picture, from the regulated doctors in ancient Babylon all the way to the high-tech labs in modern China, you see that medicine has always been this dance between tradition and revolution. So what does this big picture view tell us about what's next? And that kind of brings us to the final question, doesn't it? Al-Razi showed us that an old mystery can be solved with a new way of looking. Müller's story is a tough reminder that brilliant discoveries can get buried. And TCM shows us that ancient traditions can find a whole new life through science. So it really makes you wonder, what else is out there? What other wisdom, what other treatments from our past are just sitting there, waiting for the right person or the right piece of tech to come along and prove what they can do for our future?